Hello, Muncie Church. It's good to be with you today. My name is Allie Greer, and I am a member of the Mosaic Sunday School class at Muncie. I'm excited today to speak with you on one of my favorite stories in the New Testament. It's the story of Jesus' encounter with the Canaanite woman in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, this is a short story, only a few verses, but it's packed with an important message and one that I think is very relevant for us today. It can be found in Matthew chapter 15, so about halfway through this gospel. And at this point, Jesus and his disciples have already started their growing ministry. They've spoken in front of large crowds. Jesus has healed several people. The Pharisees and scribes have begun to challenge Jesus, and Jesus has taught in several parables. And at the moment where Jesus encounters the Canaanite woman, he is on the road. He's traveling from one place to the next with his ministry. He's finally getting a little bit of reprieve from the crowds that have followed him, from the challenges he's received from Pharisees, and he's focusing on his next steps in the next part of his journey. And as he and the disciples walk along the way, they have a disruption. So I'm going to read from chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from the region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting at us." Jesus answered her, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came before him and knelt, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Now, as you sit with this story, I wonder if your initial thoughts are similar to mine. The story is a little uncomfortable. This isn't the Jesus that I was expecting to encounter here. It's not one that follows with what I see throughout most of the Gospels. Jesus isn't the most gracious or merciful in this encounter. And it seems that I side more with the Canaanite woman than with Christ. So what is it about this story? That's what I keep coming back to. I have to pause here and wonder what's really going on. And I think that's the point the author is trying to make. It's a time for us to pause, which is generally a sign that there's a greater and very important message for us to take from this story. And as we deal with the uncomfortableness of seeing Jesus as not the perfect image we know, I want to read a little bit from a book called Clothed with the Sun by Joyce Holiday. She writes about this encounter, and when she speaks about Jesus, she acknowledges, "If he were simply perfection personified, there would be little of ourselves to see in the one who was God made flesh, and little from which to draw inspiration." This picture of Jesus we hear, one that makes us a little uncomfortable, one where Jesus doesn't necessarily live up to all the ideals we have for him, is a very humanizing moment. It's one where we should be able to connect with Jesus a little more easily. I'm sure we can think back to situations where we felt disrupted or caught off guard, and our response initially wasn't what we wished it would have been. We wish we could go back, or we finally got to the point where what we wanted to do is what we did later on. It wasn't our first response. And so here I think it's a good teaching moment, one where we can learn from Jesus' transformation, from his growth, even in this short encounter. And as we go back through this story, there's other factors we can take in that help give us a clearer picture of what's going on. Again, Jesus and the disciples are walking on their way. It's just them when all of a sudden they hear shouting. And here comes this woman. Matthew describes her as a Canaanite woman. Now it's important to know that the Canaanites were an ethnic minority and that they historically were not friendly with the Israelites. In their history, the two had been at war with each other, and Canaanites were still considered enemies of the Israelites. So here is this woman who represents a foe, not an ally, and she's coming and she's demanding that Christ help her, that he have mercy on her. Now, Jesus doesn't initially engage with her. He keeps walking on. And then his disciples come up to Jesus and basically say, "Get her out of here. She's annoying us. She's yelling at us." But instead of following the disciples' advice, Jesus decides instead to engage with her. He shares his perspective, where he's coming from with her. He says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In this moment, the woman stays persistent, and she humbles herself. She gets on her knees and says, "Lord, help me." Again, as with her first request, she acknowledges who Christ is. She calls him Lord, reflecting that she knows how powerful and that she has faith in him. But even then, Christ answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Essentially, my mission is very important. I must keep my focus there. I cannot get distracted. Yet she comes back again, persistent, and her retort is, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Saying, "Your mission is so powerful, it has such an impact that it still affects me, whether you approach me or not, whether you intend to help me or not. I know of you and I know of the power of your mission." And through her persistence, we see that Jesus responds by complimenting her faith and healing her daughter. There's a transformation in Jesus' response from the beginning to the end. It helps this woman, but Joyce Holliday in her book acknowledges that it has a bigger meaning that still has importance and significance for us today. In Clothed with the Sun, she writes, "The implications of the Canaanite woman's encounter with Jesus reach far beyond the moment. She is the only person in the New Testament who sparred verbally with Jesus and won. Even the learned scribes and Pharisees could not claim that. She was a bearer of truth to the Son of God. She opened his eyes, broadened his perspective, changed him and his mission forever. She, a woman, had taught him." By the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Christ's mandate of mission is quite different. Christ says in Matthew 28, verse 19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Through one marginalized, bold, persistent woman, Jesus understood that he had come to bring good news to all people. And perhaps he also understood that he too needed God's grace. The message turned universal. So the implications of this story, one that initially gives us pause and maybe makes us think, what is going on, is extremely significant, especially for us today. It's an important moment of transformation, where Christ's message we see gets extended. Now, respected scholars and theologians can differ on whether Christ had his mind changed by this woman, or if ultimately Christ knew he would grant her her request, but he was testing her faith. Regardless of which side you may think is correct, that is beyond me. I think there's an important message here for us as we are followers of Christ. How are we to respond in times of disruption, in circumstances where we feel uncomfortable, or we may not know how to best respond initially? See, with this imperfect Jesus, we see that we are called not to ignore a situation, not to dismiss it like the disciples, but to engage in conversation, to share our perspective, but more importantly, to hear the perspective of others, be open to what they have to say, and to be open to have our minds changed. It's a moment of great transformation for Christ and ultimately for his mission, one that affects us today. I think it's incredibly important for us today as we go through so many disruptions in our culture. As we're in the midst of a global pandemic, where our society's norms have kind of been flipped upside down for how we do our day-to-day routine. And in the midst of all of this, we as a country are again reckoning with our history of racial injustice. There are a lot of important conversations to be had in this moment, and they're not always easy ones. It's sometimes easier for us to feel like Christ in the beginning, to maybe want to ignore it, to want to be like the disciples and dismiss it and say, this is too much, please go away. But we should move towards Christ at the end, where we're open to dialogue, open to engaging, especially with those who feel marginalized, who we ourselves may be marginalizing. To be open to consider how what we think is significant may be keeping people out, or maybe isn't taking our mission to its fullest potential. See, the Canaanite woman is a great example of the opportunity for transformation that Christ can offer and that our faith can offer. And as we come to difficult moments, especially around race relations in America, we as Christians are fortunate to have great examples from our past. We can all know and love the icon Martin Luther King Jr. He and Black churches from the 50s and 60s and many Christian organizations worked tirelessly to transform what America could see as our potential and our path towards justice. Now, it's interesting to me, as someone born after Martin Luther King's assassination, is to know that at many times MLK came across maybe more like the Canaanite woman than as the icon we know today. You see, as I've been going back through some of the civil rights history recently, I noticed from the USA Today, they reflected on one of the polls of Martin Luther King. And in 1968, the year of his assassination, it's interesting to note that at the time, Martin Luther King's public disapproval rate was close to 75%. It's kind of shocking. But I think it reflects that in the moment, sometimes these conversations, these ideas for how we can be transformed to a better, more inclusive society and faith can be challenging, can be overwhelming, and can be uncomfortable. I know that even today, as I read through some of Martin Luther King's writings, I read through the letter from Birmingham jail a few weeks ago, and there Martin Luther King addresses the white moderate. There's truths there that still hit me today, of having the comfortability to step away and to ignore problems. That's not what we're called to do, especially in this story. We're called to engage, we're called to listen, and we're called to bring those who feel marginalized into our community. We may not always get it perfect. Thankfully, we have an imperfect Jesus example sometimes. And through that, we can connect and see how we can be better and strive to be more like Christ in his mercies and grace. We can be transformed as well. Because as Joyce Holliday so powerfully writes, we're to go forth and make disciples of all nations. And many times we understand this mission best when we hear from those who are marginalized, who are persistent in asking for justice and asking for inclusion, and that we are to bring this good news to all people. It's a message that is universal, and it's such a good message. It helps us go into these situations with hope. That's one thing that has amazed me with Martin Luther King. Even in times of great disapproval by the public, he still held on to hope. He knew that there was potential in all of us, his supporters and those who disagreed, that internally we all had the opportunity to be transformed and to work towards a greater future. And that was a dream he held to. In one of his last sermons, Martin Luther King talked about how he wanted to be remembered. He gave his own eulogy, essentially. He knew that death might be imminent, and in that he discussed how he wanted to be remembered. And it stuck out to me that he didn't want any of his accolades to be remembered. He didn't want to be remembered for the Nobel Peace Prize. Instead, he wanted to be remembered for trying to love others, for trying to feed the hungry, and to clothe those who were naked. He wanted to be remembered for his focus on those who we easily marginalize in our society. He wanted to be remembered for visiting those who were in prison. It's a call that we should all be open to, that we are called to serve those who may not look like us, those who are on the margins, and those who we are easy to ignore. Those are the places where we can find transformation, not only for our faith and for our community, but also for ourselves. It's a powerful story, and we have a wonderful example through Christ. As you reflect on this story and on the conversations you can have today, I hope you'll be open to listening, to engaging with those who don't look like you, who may not think like you, and to be open for transformation through who they are and what they have to share. That's my hope as we go forward, and I feel that's the way we can lead to transformation. Thank you.